7 signs your soul has already passed its hardest. Test Carl Jung's truth. What if I told you that the deepest pain you've ever experienced wasn't meant to destroy you but to transform you? Carl Jung believed that the soul's most painful test is the gateway to your highest self. In this video, we'll uncover the 7 unmistakable signs that you've not only survived that test, but you've already passed it. Part 1. Pain as the soul's ultimate test in Jungian depth psychology. Carl Jung believed that the human soul is not a static entity, but a living process. It grows, it breaks, and it heals through experiences that often arrive in the form of pain. Pain for Jung is not merely an unfortunate accident of life, but a symbolic doorway into deeper consciousness. The soul's most painful test is not a punishment, but an initiation into transformation. To understand why suffering functions in this way, we must dig into Jung's theories of individuation, shadow, and the unconscious. Pain forces us into contact with parts of ourselves we would rather avoid, and in doing so it becomes the crucible through which new life emerges. Pain does not announce itself politely. It enters like a storm through betrayal, loss, failure, or existential emptiness, and strips away illusions that once shielded us from raw truth. According to Jung, these painful tests mark the threshold moments of individuation, the process by which the individual integrates unconscious contents into consciousness to become whole. To pass such a test is to endure the storm without breaking into pieces of despair. It means facing the dark night of the soul and walking through it until morning comes. The signs that someone has passed this test are not external trophies, but internal transformations, changes in perception, resilience, and orientation toward life. Pain as a portal to individuation. Individuation is Jung's term for the lifelong psychological process of becoming who you truly are, beyond masks, roles, and conditioned identities. It is not simply self-improvement. It is the confrontation with both the conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. Pain acts as the alarm clock of individuation. When life flows smoothly, we rarely question the structures of our existence. It is in pain, especially deep soul-shaking pain, that the ego is forced to recognize its limitations. The painful test shatters the illusion of control and compels the psyche to reconfigure itself at a higher level of integration. For example, imagine a person whose identity is wrapped around their career success. When sudden failure arrives, being fired, humiliated, or replaced, the blow is not only financial but existential. It destabilizes the ego. In this collapse, Jung would argue, lies the possibility for individuation. The individual may finally confront the shadow aspects of themselves, fear of inadequacy, suppressed creativity, or dependency on external validation, and in bringing these into consciousness, they begin to transcend the narrow ego. The pain is not the enemy, but the raw material of transformation. The symbolic role of pain, Jung often emphasized that the psyche speaks in symbols. Pain, therefore, is rarely about the literal event alone. A breakup, for instance, is not just about losing a partner. It is about confronting the archetype of abandonment, the primal fear of being unloved. The soul's painful test uses outer circumstances to activate inner wounds that have been repressed for years. Passing the test means decoding the symbolic dimension of suffering instead of staying stuck in the literal narrative. If someone says, "My partner left me," they are naming the surface. But if they recognize, "This pain is forcing me to confront my dependency, my fear of solitude, my unconscious patterns of attachment," they are moving towards transformation. Consider Jung's idea of synchronicity. Many painful events arrive with uncanny timing, as if orchestrated by something beyond coincidence. A betrayal may occur precisely when you are ready at some unconscious level to confront illusions about love. An illness may appear when you have avoided inner conflict for too long. To Jung, such synchronicities suggest that the painful test is not random but part of the soul's teleology, its drive toward wholeness. Pain becomes purposeful, not meaningless. The shadow and the test of suffering, central to Jung's depth psychology, is the concept of the shadow, the repressed, denied aspects of the personality that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. Pain is often the voice of the shadow breaking through. If someone represses anger, for instance, they may experience painful relationships that mirror this suppressed aggression back to them. The soul's most painful test, therefore, is usually a confrontation with the shadow in its rawest form. Passing the test does not mean eradicating the shadow, but integrating it, acknowledging, yes, this too is me. Without pain, the shadow remains hidden. With pain, it becomes impossible to ignore. Passing the painful test involves enduring the projection of the shadow without collapsing. If you always blame others for your suffering, you fail the test. If you begin to withdraw projections and see the shadow as part of your own psyche, you move toward mastery. Jung believed that the integration of shadow material leads to authenticity. It is not about becoming morally perfect, but becoming real, and nothing forces us into this authenticity more than soul-crushing pain. Ego death as a threshold. The ego is the structure of consciousness that organizes identity. It wants stability, recognition, and control. But the soul's painful test often requires what mystics call ego death, the collapse of the old identity. Jung described moments when the ego experiences annihilation, a sense that everything one has known about oneself is falling apart. This annihilation is terrifying, but it is also liberating. The individual no longer clings to the illusion that the ego is the totality of the self. Something larger, the self with a capital S, begins to emerge. Ego death can occur through profound grief, trauma, or existential despair. For example, losing a loved one can collapse the identity built around being a partner, spouse, or child. The painful test strips the ego bare and demands a new orientation. Passing it requires surrender, letting go of the illusion that the ego can control life. Jung insisted that this surrender is not passive resignation but active participation in transformation. It means recognizing that the self, not the ego, is the center of the psyche. Archetypal dimensions of the test. Jung believed that archetypes, universal psychic patterns, shape human experience. Painful tests often activate archetypes such as the wounded healer, the orphan, or the hero. Each archetype carries symbolic energy that guides the soul through suffering. For instance, when someone feels abandoned, they may unconsciously embody the orphan archetype, which demands the discovery of inner resources rather than external rescue. Passing the painful test means consciously engaging these archetypal patterns instead of being overwhelmed by them. The soul recognizes itself as part of a larger myth, not merely an isolated individual tragedy. This mythological framing is crucial. When people view their suffering only through the personal lens, they feel trapped. When they recognize it as an archetypal initiation, the suffering acquires dignity. They realize they are not alone but participating in a timeless human drama. Jung often compared psychological suffering to the alchemical process of turning lead into gold. The painful test is the alchemical fire burning away impurities and forging the soul into something more resilient. The alchemy of transformation. Alchemy for Jung was a symbolic map of individuation. The stages of alchemy: nigredo blackening, albedo whitening, citrinitas yellowing, and rubedo reddening mirror, the stages of psychological transformation. The soul's painful test corresponds to nigredo, the dark night when everything seems lost. Depression, despair, confusion, this is the blackening. Most people fear nigredo and try to escape it through distraction, addiction, or denial. But to pass the test is to endure nigredo until it yields albedo, the whitening of clarity. Suddenly, meaning emerges from the chaos. Insights arise. A new self takes shape. Eventually, rubedo, the reddening, symbolizes integration. The individual emerges transformed, embodying vitality and purpose. The alchemical metaphor shows that pain is not accidental but structural. Just as metals cannot be purified without fire, the soul cannot be refined without suffering. Jung insisted that individuation requires this fiery trial. The painful test is not optional. It is built into the architecture of growth. Real-life manifestations. How does this look in practice? Consider someone who has gone through a devastating divorce. At first, the experience feels like death, identity, collapse, loneliness, financial instability. This is nigredo. Over time, however, if the person confronts their unconscious patterns, why they chose certain partners, why they repeated destructive cycles, they begin to see clarity. This is albedo. Finally, as they integrate their lessons, they emerge stronger, wiser, and more authentic. They no longer choose partners from desperation, but from wholeness. This is rubedo. They have passed the soul's painful test. Another example, someone facing life-threatening illness. The body's vulnerability forces them to confront mortality. Fear and despair dominate at first. But as they surrender, they may discover depths of courage, compassion, and spiritual insight they never knew they possessed. They realize that life is not about quantity, but depth. Their relationships become more authentic, their values shift. Passing the test transforms not only the individual, but everyone around them. Psychological resistance. Why do many people fail the painful test? Because resistance to pain is fierce. The ego wants to avoid suffering at all costs. It seeks escape through denial, projection, or numbing behaviors. Jung observed that neurosis often arises when individuals refuse to face the soul's painful demands. Instead of integrating the shadow, they repress it, which leads to symptoms, compulsions, or self-sabotage. The painful test becomes unbearable precisely because it is resisted. Passing it requires the opposite, radical acceptance, not resignation, but the courage to face what is. Resistance also appears culturally. Modern society often pathologizes pain, treating it as something to eradicate quickly rather than understand symbolically. Jung criticized this attitude. He argued that by medicalizing or trivializing suffering, we lose its transformative power. The soul's painful test cannot be bypassed with shortcuts. It must be endured and integrated. The first sign: acceptance. The very first sign that you have passed the soul's most painful test is acceptance. Acceptance does not mean liking the suffering or pretending it was good. It means ceasing to fight against what has already happened. Jung emphasized that neurosis thrives on refusal. The psyche becomes split when the ego says, "This should not have happened." Healing begins when the ego finally concedes, "It did happen and I must face it." This acceptance is the doorway to individuation. It signals that the soul has survived the storm without collapsing into bitterness. Acceptance brings with it a quiet dignity. The person no longer wastes energy in endless why me loops. They recognize that suffering is part of the human condition. They stand in reality, not illusion. This is why Jung insisted that wholeness, not happiness, is the true goal of life. Passing the painful test replaces the shallow pursuit of happiness with the deeper pursuit of wholeness. Acceptance is the first and clearest sign of this shift. Part 2. The release of fear and the dissolution of the ego. Fear is one of the most primitive emotions of the human psyche. It is rooted deeply in our biology, protecting us from external dangers. But when fear extends into the inner landscape, it paralyzes growth. Jung considered fear a barrier to individuation because it keeps the ego attached to old patterns. The soul's most painful test almost always confronts an individual with their deepest fears: the fear of being unloved, the fear of loss, the fear of insignificance, and ultimately the fear of death. Passing the test means something extraordinary. Fear loosens its grip, and life is no longer lived under its constant shadow. The second sign that someone has passed the soul's most painful test is the profound release of fear. It is not that fear disappears entirely. Even enlightened individuals still feel moments of fear. The difference is that fear no longer dominates their decision-making, their identity, or their relationships. They act despite fear rather than being ruled by it. This release of fear is not achieved through willpower alone. It arises naturally when the psyche has endured suffering and recognized that survival is possible even in the worst conditions. Having walked through fire and lived, fear loses its tyranny. Fear as a shadow projection. In Jungian psychology, fear is often the projection of the shadow. We fear others because they reflect parts of ourselves we have not integrated. A person terrified of betrayal may unconsciously repress their own capacity to betray. A person afraid of failure may repress their own ambition, fearing the shadow of inadequacy. The soul's painful test often brings these fears into reality. The betrayal actually happens, the failure actually arrives. In that confrontation, fear can no longer remain abstract, it must be faced directly. This is why the release of fear often comes only after the painful test. Before the test, fear is hypothetical, and the ego avoids risk to maintain safety. After the test, the worst has happened, and the individual realizes that life continues. The betrayal did not annihilate them. The failure did not erase their worth. Death did not claim them yet. This recognition transforms fear into perspective. Instead of being enslaved by projections, the individual sees fear as a mirror of unconscious content and no longer bows to it. The archetype of the warrior, fear and courage, are archetypal opposites. When fear dominates, the psyche is trapped in the archetype of the child seeking protection and safety. Passing the soul's painful test activates the warrior archetype. The warrior does not eliminate fear but learns to move through it. Jung noted that archetypes are not chosen consciously, they are activated through life events. The painful test, by its very intensity, often awakens the warrior. Someone who has survived deep suffering carries a quiet strength that others can sense. They are not reckless but resolute. Their presence communicates, "I have been through fire, and I will not be shaken easily." The release of fear is therefore not naive optimism. It is seasoned courage. It is the capacity to face reality without denial. This is why survivors of deep suffering often become guides or mentors. Their energy carries the warrior's imprint, strength born of battle, compassion born of wounds. The second sign, release of fear, reveals itself not in bravado but in calm resilience. Fear of death and the expansion of consciousness. Perhaps the most profound fear humans face is the fear of death. Jung argued that death is not merely a biological event but a psychological archetype. To fear death excessively is to resist the natural cycle of life. Many people do not confront death until a painful test forces them to, through illness, the loss of a loved one, or existential crisis. Passing the test often reduces the terror of mortality. The individual realizes that the psyche, in Jung's terms, is more than the ego. Consciousness may not end with biological death. Whether or not one believes in an afterlife, the confrontation with mortality deepens the sense of the sacredness of existence. When fear of death lessens, life paradoxically becomes richer. Small anxieties lose their grip. The fear of public judgment, career setbacks, or material loss seems trivial compared to the vast horizon of mortality. This shift liberates the soul. The individual no longer lives to avoid death but to embody life fully. Jung described this as a transition from living in service of the ego to living in service of the self. The release of fear of death is therefore one of the clearest indicators that the soul has passed its painful initiation. The third sign, dissolution of the ego. Closely tied to the release of fear is the third sign, the dissolution of the ego. The ego, as Jung defined it, is the conscious identity that organizes our thoughts, roles, and perceptions. It is necessary for functioning in the world, but when overinflated, it becomes tyrannical. The ego wants control, recognition, and certainty. The soul's painful test often shatters the ego's illusions. It reveals how fragile the ego truly is. The dissolution of the ego is not its destruction, but its dethronement. The ego no longer sits on the throne of the psyche. The self, the deeper totality, takes that place. Ego dissolution often feels like death. People describe it as losing everything they thought they were. The successful business person whose empire collapses, the devoted parent whose child leaves home, the proud spouse whose marriage ends. These are all moments when the ego identity crumbles. Before the painful test, the ego insists, This is who I am. After the test that identity no longer holds. At first this collapse feels like annihilation, but in time it reveals itself as liberation. The individual realizes, I am not only my role, my title, or my achievements, I am something larger. The self as center. Jung distinguished between the ego and the self. The ego is the center of consciousness, while the self is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. The painful test dismantles the ego so that the self can emerge as the new center. This shift is radical. Instead of living from a place of constant self-assertion, the individual begins to live from a place of alignment with deeper meaning. They no longer ask, how do I protect my identity, but how do I serve the unfolding of my soul? This orientation creates humility. Passing the painful test often results in a humility that is not weakness but strength, the humility of knowing one's true place in the cosmos. Archetypes of death and rebirth. The ego's dissolution mirrors archetypal myths of death and rebirth. In countless traditions, the hero must die before being reborn. Jung interpreted these myths as symbols of psychological transformation. The soul's painful test enacts this myth on an individual level. When the ego dies, the old self is buried. The rebirth is not a return to the old identity, but the birth of a new one grounded in authenticity. Those who pass the test often describe it as a second life, a life lived more honestly, more fully, more compassionately. They do not cling to the past, they step into the new. Real-life example, addiction and ego dissolution. Consider the case of addiction. The addict's ego often clings to the illusion of control. I can stop any time I am still in charge. The painful test comes when the addiction wreaks havoc, relationships break, health deteriorates, dignity collapses. The ego's illusion is shattered. For many, this is the darkest moment. But for those who endure this ego, death becomes the foundation of transformation. Recovery programs often emphasize surrender, recognizing that the ego cannot heal itself, that one must submit to a higher power or deeper self. This surrender marks the dissolution of the ego. Fear no longer rules because the worst has already been faced. A new life begins, one not built on ego illusion but on truth. Freedom beyond ego and fear. When fear releases and the ego dissolves, freedom emerges. This freedom is not reckless indulgence, but inner spaciousness. The individual no longer makes decisions primarily out of fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of inadequacy, nor do they act only to inflate the ego with status or recognition. Instead, their actions flow from authenticity. They follow meaning, not fear. They embody self, not ego. This freedom radiates in subtle ways. They listen more deeply, love more honestly, and live more simply. They are not easily manipulated because fear no longer governs them. They are not easily seduced because ego recognition no longer defines them. They have passed the soul's painful test. Part 3. Finding meaning in suffering and the birth of deep empathy. Meaning as the antidote to suffering. Viktor Frankl, whose work was deeply influenced by Jung, once said that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. Jung would have agreed wholeheartedly. The fourth sign that someone has passed the soul's most painful test is their ability to locate meaning in what once felt like senseless torment. At the height of suffering, pain feels arbitrary, even cruel. Why me? Why now becomes the inner cry. But when the storm subsides and the psyche integrates the experience, the individual discovers that the suffering carried a hidden purpose. The event that once looked like destruction reveals itself as initiation. Meaning does not arrive instantly. Jung often reminded us that symbols and dreams take time to unfold. Similarly, the meaning of suffering ripens over months or years. At first, the pain feels like meaningless chaos, but the individual who perseveres begins to perceive subtle shifts, new strengths, new insights, new values. The painful test reorganizes priorities. What once seemed urgent loses its hold. What once seemed trivial gains significance. For example, someone who endured betrayal may years later recognize that the experience taught them discernment, boundaries, and self-respect. Without the betrayal, they would have remained naive. The suffering became a teacher, however harsh. The archetype of the wounded healer. Jung described the archetype of the wounded healer drawn from the myth of Chiron the centaur, who could not heal his own wound but became a healer to others. This archetype illuminates the link between suffering and meaning. To pass the painful test is to embrace one's wounds as sources of wisdom rather than shame. The individual no longer hides scars but recognizes them as credentials of survival. Their suffering becomes meaningful when it allows them to empathize with and assist others. The wound transforms into medicine. The wounded healer archetype also explains why those who have passed painful tests often gravitate toward helping professions, therapists, teachers, spiritual guides, or simply become informal sources of wisdom within their communities. Their pain has not been wasted, it has been transmuted into service. Meaning emerges not in spite of suffering but because of it. The painful test, when passed, opens the heart to compassion. Transformation of perspective. Another aspect of finding meaning is the expansion of perspective. Jung often noted that the ego views events narrowly in terms of immediate pleasure or pain. The self, by contrast, sees life symbolically and teleologically. When the self becomes the center of the psyche after the painful test, the individual perceives suffering as part of a larger narrative. They realize, this hardship was shaping me for something greater. This does not romanticize suffering, it recognizes its role in psychic evolution. The fourth sign, meaning in suffering, is essentially a shift from the ego's despair to the self's perspective. For example, many who endure life-threatening illness later say, "The illness gave me back my life." Stripped of illusions, they realign with authenticity. They stop wasting time on trivialities. They live with greater presence. The illness, though brutal, delivered meaning. Similarly, those who survive profound loss often say, "I finally understood what love really is." The suffering illuminated truths that comfort and success could not. This reframing marks the soul's passage through the test. Alchemy of meaning. Jung used the metaphor of alchemy to describe psychological transformation. Just as alchemists sought to transmute base metals into gold, the psyche transmutes raw pain into wisdom. The painful test is the alchemical furnace. To find meaning in suffering is to discover the gold within the lead of agony. The nigredo stage, the black night of despair, gives way to albedo when clarity emerges, and eventually rubedo when new vitality is integrated. This alchemical cycle demonstrates that meaning is not imposed artificially but discovered through endurance. One cannot skip nigredo and still expect gold. The painful test must burn thoroughly before meaning crystallizes. The fifth sign, deep empathy. Flowing directly from meaning is the fifth sign, deep empathy. Once a person has endured their soul's most painful test and extracted meaning, they can no longer view others' suffering superficially. They recognize the universality of pain. Empathy deepens because their own suffering cracked open defenses that once allowed them to dismiss others. Before the painful test, they may have judged the suffering of others as weakness or misfortune. Afterward, they see it as the common thread of humanity. Their heart softens not out of pity but out of resonance. Jung believed that empathy emerges when projections are withdrawn. Before integration, we project our unacknowledged pain onto others and respond with judgment. After integration, we see ourselves in others. The one who betrayed us mirrors our own shadow. The one who failed mirrors our own vulnerability. Passing the painful test dissolves the illusion of separateness. Deep empathy arises not from intellectual moralizing but from embodied experience. I have been there. I know this pain. The archetype of the mother. The archetype of the mother often awakens in those who pass the painful test. Not limited to women, this archetype embodies nurturance, compassion, and unconditional care. Having survived suffering, individuals often develop a motherly capacity to comfort others. Their empathy is not sentimental but grounded. They do not try to rescue people prematurely, but hold space for suffering to unfold. They recognize from their own journey that pain is transformative when endured. Thus, their empathy does not strip suffering of meaning but accompanies others through it. Boundaries and authentic empathy. It is important to distinguish deep empathy from self-sacrifice. Those who have not integrated their suffering may confuse empathy with rescuing. They may enable destructive behaviors in others, mistaking this for compassion. But genuine empathy born from passing the painful test is coupled with boundaries. Having learned the cost of their own wounds, such individuals know that empathy without limits leads to burnout or exploitation. Their empathy is discerning. They can say, "I feel your pain, but I will not allow your shadow to consume me." This balance of compassion and boundary is a hallmark of maturity. Empathy as collective healing. On a collective level, those who embody deep empathy become agents of healing. Jung believed that the individual's transformation contributes to the healing of the collective unconscious. When one person integrates suffering, they shift the psychic field around them. Their empathy ripples outward. Families become less toxic communities, more compassionate societies, more just. Passing the painful test is therefore not merely personal victory. It has collective implications. The world needs individuals who embody this fifth sign because empathy counters the collective shadow of cruelty, indifference, and division. Real-life examples: survivors and empathy. Consider survivors of war, abuse, or displacement. Many, after enduring unimaginable pain, dedicate their lives to preventing similar suffering in others. They become activists, counselors, or quiet pillars of support. Their empathy is not theoretical, it is lived. Similarly, those who have lost loved ones often create support groups for others in grief. Their own wound becomes the bridge of understanding. They embody the archetype of the wounded healer, transforming personal tragedy into communal compassion. This is the fifth sign in action: deep empathy that transcends personal pain to become a force of connection. Spiritual dimensions of empathy. From a spiritual perspective, empathy signifies the recognition of shared essence. Jung, though a psychologist, often spoke in spiritual language when discussing the self. The painful test strips away illusions of separateness. Empathy arises when one realizes that every soul is engaged in its own trial. The boundaries between me and you blur. Suffering reveals the fundamental unity of existence. This recognition births compassion, not as a moral duty, but as a natural response. Empathy becomes as instinctive as breathing. It is the soul recognizing itself in another. Integration of signs. 4 and 5. The fourth and fifth signs are deeply interconnected. Finding meaning in suffering makes empathy possible. Without meaning, suffering often breeds bitterness and cynicism. A bitter person may become hardened, incapable of empathy. But when meaning is found, the heart opens. Pain no longer isolates but connects. The scar becomes a bridge. The person who has passed the painful test embodies both resilience and tenderness. They are strong enough to endure, yet soft enough to feel. This paradox is the essence of maturity. It is why Jung insisted that wholeness, not perfection, is the aim of individuation. Wholeness includes wounds, and wounds, when integrated, give rise to empathy. Part 4. Inner peace instead of outer drama. The shift from external conflict to internal harmony. The sixth sign that someone has truly passed the soul's most painful test is the emergence of inner peace. This peace is not superficial calmness or temporary relief, but a deep, enduring stability that no longer depends on external circumstances. Before passing the painful test, many individuals live in a cycle of drama, conflicts with others, battles for recognition, constant reactions to perceived slights. Their inner world is restless, and the chaos spills into outer life. After the painful test, however, a profound shift occurs. Drama loses its appeal, conflict loses its grip, and peace becomes the new baseline. Carl Jung often emphasized that what we experience outwardly mirrors what exists inwardly. A psyche in conflict projects its turmoil onto relationships, careers, and communities. When the unconscious remains unintegrated, we are drawn compulsively to external dramas as a way of avoiding the unresolved chaos within. The painful test forces us into that chaos. It strips away distractions and confronts us with our deepest shadows. Once those shadows are integrated, the inner conflict dissolves, and with it the need for outer drama. Drama as a projection of the shadow. To understand why peace replaces drama after passing the test, we must revisit Jung's concept of projection. When individuals repress aspects of their personality, those contents do not vanish, they are projected onto others. Someone who denies their own anger may attract endless conflict, accusing others of hostility. Someone who represses vulnerability may be obsessed with toxic people, never realizing their own shadow is at play. Drama is often nothing more than shadow play acted out in relationships. The soul's painful test confronts the individual with these projections in an unavoidable way. Through betrayal, abandonment, or failure, the shadow is thrust into the light. The individual can no longer blame others indefinitely. They must turn inward. Passing the test means reclaiming projections and integrating the shadow. Once this occurs, the compulsion toward outer drama diminishes. Conflict no longer feels magnetic. The individual no longer needs to externalize inner battles. They carry their shadow consciously, and thus they can relate to others without endless projection. Archetypal patterns of drama. Drama itself is archetypal. Jung identified archetypes like the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer, which often play out in what psychologists now call the drama triangle. Before integration, individuals unconsciously step into these roles. They may oscillate between being the victim of others' cruelty, the rescuer of those in pain, or the persecutor who lashes out in projection. The painful test exposes this archetypal cycle. When the individual recognizes their participation in these roles, they gain the freedom to step out of the triangle altogether. The sixth sign, inner peace, emerges when the individual refuses to play these archetypal games. They no longer need to be the victim, no longer need to rescue compulsively, and no longer persecute others to discharge inner conflict. They stand outside the cycle, rooted in self rather than ego. The archetypal energies are still present, but they are no longer unconscious. The person can see the dynamics without being consumed by them. This awareness itself creates peace. From reactivity to response, one of the clearest indicators of inner peace is the shift from reactivity to conscious response. Before passing the painful test, people often live in constant reaction. A comment, a glance, a minor disappointment, each triggers disproportionate anger or anxiety. The ego is hypersensitive, always seeking affirmation, always defending against imagined threats. After the painful test, sensitivity remains, but it is transformed. The individual can feel emotions without being enslaved by them. They pause, they choose, they respond. Jung would describe this as a movement from ego consciousness to self-consciousness. The ego reacts instinctively, defending itself at all costs. The self observes calmly, recognizing that no single insult or setback defines the whole of existence. This broader perspective allows the person to remain centered in situations that once would have produced turmoil. Inner peace manifests not in the absence of emotion, but in the freedom from automatic reaction. The archetype of the sage. The archetype that best embodies this peace is the sage. In myths and stories, the sage is calm, wise, and detached from petty conflicts. They observe without judgment, advise without ego, and act without the need for recognition. After passing the painful test, many individuals unconsciously embody this archetype. Their presence itself feels calming. Others sense that they are no longer caught in the storms of drama. This is not aloofness, but maturity. The sage archetype represents integration, the ability to hold opposites in balance without being consumed. The silence that speaks. A striking characteristic of inner peace is silence. Those who have passed the painful test no longer need to explain themselves endlessly or argue to prove their worth. Their silence is not repression but power. Jung noted that when the unconscious is integrated, speech becomes more deliberate and words carry weight. The constant chatter of insecurity quiets. What remains is intentional communication. This silence unsettles those still addicted to drama because it refuses to feed the cycle. Instead, it communicates strength without aggression. The end of victimhood. Inner peace also signifies the end of victimhood. Before integration, people often identify with being wronged. Their narratives revolve around betrayal, injustice, or misfortune. They replay these stories endlessly, fueling drama. The painful test forces the individual to see that while they may have been harmed, clinging to victimhood perpetuates suffering. Passing the test does not deny the reality of harm, but releases the identification with it. The person no longer says, "I am what happened to me." They say, "I am who I became through what happened." This subtle shift transforms relationships. Others can no longer manipulate them through guilt or pity. Their inner peace radiates autonomy. Real-life manifestations. Consider someone who before their painful test was constantly embroiled in conflicts, arguing with partners, feuding with co-workers, consumed by social drama. After enduring a profound loss or betrayal, they emerge transformed. Suddenly, they no longer feel the need to argue over trivialities. They choose relationships, carefully valuing authenticity over chaos. They walk away from gossip, avoid toxic cycles, and cherish solitude. Friends may notice, "You're so calm now. Nothing seems to shake you." This is the sixth sign in practice. Another example, a person who once feared being alone now enjoys solitude after the painful test. They no longer seek validation in dramatic entanglements. Their peace attracts different kinds of relationships, balanced, respectful, nourishing. This shift demonstrates how inner peace is not only psychological but practical. It reorganizes the entire fabric of life. Spiritual dimensions of peace. From a spiritual perspective, inner peace signifies alignment with the self, which Jung considered the imago Dei, the image of God within the psyche. When the ego collapses and the self rises, the soul rests in its true center. Outer drama loses its grip because the inner foundation is unshakable. This peace is not indifference, it is sacred stillness. It allows the individual to participate in life fully without being consumed by its turbulence. In religious traditions, this state is often described as the peace that surpasses understanding. Jung would frame it psychologically, but affirm its spiritual depth. The cost of peace. It is worth noting that inner peace comes at a cost. To reach this point, the individual has endured storms that nearly destroyed them. Their peace is not naive tranquility, but earned serenity. They know chaos intimately. That is why they no longer crave it. Others may misinterpret this peace as coldness or detachment, but in truth, it is the maturity that comes only through suffering. The painful test strips away illusions, and what remains is authenticity. Inner peace is not an escape from life, but a deeper participation in it, free from the compulsions of the unconscious. Part 5. Rebirth and the redefinition of life's path. The archetype of death and rebirth. The seventh and final sign that someone has passed the soul's most painful test is the profound experience of rebirth. In Jungian terms, this is the archetypal cycle of death and renewal, one of the most ancient symbols embedded in the collective unconscious. Every myth, from the phoenix rising from ashes to Christ's resurrection, reflects this pattern. The painful test enacts this myth on a psychological level. What once defined the individual dies and something new emerges. The rebirth is not symbolic fluff, it is felt as a radical reorientation of life. The person no longer walks the same path. Their goals, values, and identity are redefined. Jung described this archetypal experience as the confrontation with the self. When the ego dies through suffering, the self emerges as the new center of the psyche. This is not a minor adjustment, but a seismic transformation. The person is reborn into alignment with their deeper essence. Their life becomes less about conformity and more about authenticity. They step into the unique calling that was obscured by ego illusions. Rebirth is the flowering of individuality after the fire of suffering has purified the soul. Redefining identity. Before the painful test, people often cling to borrowed identities, professional titles, family roles, societal expectations. They define themselves by what they do or what others think. The painful test shatters these identifications. Losing a job, a relationship, or a social role forces the person to ask, "Who am I without this?" At first, the loss feels like annihilation. But as the psyche reorganizes, a deeper identity emerges. This new identity is not imposed externally, but discovered internally. For example, someone who identified solely as a spouse may feel destroyed by divorce. Over time, however, they may discover aspects of themselves long suppressed: creativity, independence, or spiritual longing. Their rebirth involves redefining identity beyond the old role. They become more expansive, more integrated. This redefinition is not about adding new labels, but embodying authenticity. They no longer ask, "Who should I be?" but "Who am I truly?" Purpose after pain. One hallmark of rebirth is the discovery of new purpose. Jung believed that meaning is teleological. The psyche moves toward a goal. The painful test clears away illusions that obstruct this purpose. Once those illusions burn away, the soul redirects itself. The person often feels a strong pull toward a vocation, cause, or way of living that aligns with their authentic nature. Consider the survivor of illness who becomes an advocate for health, or the person who lost everything in financial ruin, but then dedicates themselves to teaching others resilience. Their suffering becomes the soil from which purpose grows. This is not forced optimism, but genuine transformation. The painful test did not just end, it redirected the trajectory of life. Rebirth means living with intentionality, no longer drifting in unconscious patterns. The hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, influenced by Jung, described the hero's journey as a universal myth: departure, initiation, and return. The painful test corresponds to initiation, the darkest trial. Rebirth corresponds to return. The hero comes back to the world transformed, bearing gifts. Those who pass the painful test embody this myth. They return to ordinary life but are no longer ordinary themselves. They bring new wisdom, compassion, and authenticity. Their life's path is redefined in ways that impact not only themselves but also their communities. This redefinition often surprises others. Friends may say, "You're not the same person anymore," and indeed they are not. The old self has died. The reborn individual carries a new orientation, one that cannot be explained to those who have not endured similar trials. Their life feels mythic because it has enacted the archetypal cycle of death and rebirth. Psychological markers of rebirth. Several psychological markers indicate this rebirth. 1. Detachment from the old self. The individual no longer identifies with past roles, traumas, or illusions. They can speak of their old life as if it belonged to someone else. 2. Spontaneity and creativity. Rebirth unlocks creativity as the psyche is no longer bound by rigid ego defenses. Jung noted that creativity often surges after integration. 3. Resilience and flexibility. Having survived destruction, the person no longer fears change. They adapt fluidly, knowing they can rebuild. 4. Authentic relationships. Rebirth reshapes relational patterns. The individual seeks connections based on truth, not validation. 5. Spiritual depth. Whether religious or not, rebirth brings a sense of the sacred. Life feels infused with significance. The archetype of the phoenix. Few images capture rebirth better than the phoenix. Consumed by fire, it dies only to rise anew from ashes. Jung would interpret the phoenix as an archetype of transformation, an image arising from the collective unconscious to symbolize the soul's renewal. When someone passes their painful test, they embody the phoenix. Their old life burnt to cinders gives rise to a stronger, freer existence. The ashes are not wasted, they are the foundation of new life. The phoenix metaphor emphasizes that rebirth is not avoidance of suffering but its culmination. The fire of pain is what enables renewal. Without destruction, there is no phoenix. Similarly, without the painful test, the soul cannot reach this stage of transformation. Real-life manifestations of rebirth. Imagine a person who spent decades chasing material success only to lose everything in a financial collapse. At first, despair consumes them, but over time they discover that their old life was hollow, built on external validation. In their rebirth, they become a teacher, guiding others toward meaningful living. Their financial ruin, once seen as tragedy, becomes the doorway to authenticity. Another example, a parent who loses a child may feel their life has ended. Yet years later they may create foundations, write books, or counsel grieving families. Their rebirth does not erase their pain, but redefines it as a calling. The loss becomes woven into a new life path that honors both their suffering and their resilience. Spiritual dimensions of rebirth. From a spiritual perspective, rebirth is alignment with the self as the imago Dei, the divine image within. Jung believed that individuation mirrors spiritual awakening. Rebirth feels like awakening to a higher order of existence. The individual no longer sees life as random, but as meaningful participation in a larger whole. This spiritual depth infuses daily life with reverence. Even ordinary acts feel sacred. The reborn soul walks with awareness, no longer asleep in unconscious patterns. The courage to begin again. Rebirth also requires courage. Many people resist new beginnings, clinging to the familiarity of old suffering. Passing the painful test means daring to step into uncharted territory. The reborn individual takes risks, not reckless ones, but risks aligned with authenticity. They may change careers, leave stagnant relationships, or relocate to embody their new path. Their courage comes not from ego bravado, but from trust in the self. They have survived destruction. They can survive uncertainty. This courage marks the completion of the cycle. Collective implications of rebirth. Jung emphasized that individual transformation contributes to collective transformation. When one person is reborn, their presence ripples outward. Families shift, communities evolve, societies gain new possibilities. The reborn individual often becomes a quiet, revolutionary, challenging systems built on illusion. Their authenticity exposes falseness, and their peace disrupts collective drama. The painful test, therefore, is not only personal, it has cultural significance. The world needs reborn souls to guide it toward wholeness. Part 6. Integration of all 7 signs into a Jungian framework of transformation, the journey as a whole. When examined separately, each of the 7 signs, acceptance, release of fear, ego, dissolution, finding meaning, deep empathy, inner peace, and rebirth, appears as an individual marker of growth. But in Jungian depth psychology, the true power emerges when these signs are understood as a unified process. Jung would argue that they are not random achievements but sequential stages in the archetypal journey of individuation. The painful test functions as the initiatory trial, and these 7 signs are the evidence that the psyche has moved through death, integration, and renewal. Jung always insisted that psychological transformation must be viewed holistically. Just as alchemy describes the transmutation of matter through stages, individuation describes the transformation of the soul through trials. The 7 signs map onto this process like stations on the path. Integration means recognizing how each sign builds upon the others, culminating in a life lived from the self rather than the ego. From fragmentation to wholeness. The painful test often begins with fragmentation. The ego collapses under the weight of betrayal, loss, or despair. The individual feels split, broken, and disoriented. The 7 signs mark the gradual reintegration of the psyche. Acceptance lays the foundation, release of fear clears the way, and ego dissolution dismantles illusions. Meaning provides coherence, empathy, reconnects with humanity, peace establishes stability, and rebirth signals wholeness. Seen together, these signs represent the passage from fragmentation to integration, from shadow-driven existence to self-centered living. The shadow's role in the 7 signs. The shadow, a central concept in Jung's psychology, plays a crucial role in each stage. In acceptance, the individual acknowledges reality, rather than denying it, often because the shadow has surfaced and can no longer be ignored. In releasing fear, the individual confronts the shadow's projections. In ego dissolution, the shadow destabilizes the old identity. Meaning is found when the shadow's contents are integrated rather than repressed. Empathy arises when projections are withdrawn, and the shadow is owned. Inner peace emerges when the shadow no longer needs to erupt in outer drama. Rebirth occurs when the shadow is not eliminated but harmonized with conscious life. Integration of the 7 signs means the shadow has been fully faced and assimilated into wholeness. Archetypal framework. Each sign also corresponds to archetypal energies that structure the psyche. Acceptance evokes the orphan archetype, who learns to survive abandonment by facing reality. Release of fear awakens the warrior who moves forward despite danger. Ego dissolution enacts the archetype of death, demanding surrender of the old self. Finding meaning activates the wounded healer who transforms suffering into wisdom. Empathy awakens the mother who nurtures and comforts from authentic care. Inner peace embodies the sage who lives above drama in clarity. Rebirth mirrors the phoenix or hero who returns, transformed to a new life. Taken together, these archetypes form a mythic constellation. The painful test activates each in sequence, guiding the soul through a symbolic narrative. Integration means recognizing these archetypes not as external myths, but as living forces within the psyche. Alchemy of the psyche. Jung believed that alchemy symbolized the individuation process. The 7 signs map naturally onto alchemical stages. Nigredo, blackening. The collapse of ego and shadow eruption. Signs 1-3. Albedo, whitening, illumination through meaning and empathy. Signs 4-5. Citrinitas, yellowing, stabilization through peace. Sign 6. Rubedo, reddening, integration and renewal through rebirth. Sign 7. This alchemical framework reveals that the 7 signs are not arbitrary but archetypally structured. They form a symbolic chemistry of the soul, transmuting pain into wisdom, fear into courage, fragmentation into wholeness. Integration means understanding suffering as part of this alchemical process, rather than as meaningless cruelty. Psychological integration. From a clinical perspective, integration of the 7 signs means the psyche has reorganized around the self. Symptoms that once dominated anxiety, depression, compulsions lose their power. The person no longer lives in chronic defense against unconscious material. They can tolerate ambivalence, hold paradox, and face life without repression. Integration is visible in everyday behavior, balanced relationships, creative expression, authentic communication, and resilience in adversity. The 7 signs are not abstract ideals but practical indicators of psychological health. Spiritual integration. Though Jung framed his theories psychologically, he acknowledged their spiritual dimension. Integration of the 7 signs often feels like spiritual awakening. Acceptance mirrors surrender. The release of fear resembles faith. Ego dissolution echoes mystical death, meaning reflects revelation. Empathy mirrors compassion. Peace aligns with stillness, and rebirth resonates with resurrection. Jung would say these parallels exist because psychology and spirituality draw from the same archetypal source, the collective unconscious. The 7 signs represent the soul's sacred transformation, whether one interprets it religiously or psychologically. Collective implications. Jung argued that the individual's transformation contributes to the healing of the collective unconscious. The integration of the 7 signs is not merely personal, it shifts the psychic field around the person. Families, communities, and societies benefit when individuals embody authenticity, empathy, and peace. Drama diminishes compassion, spreads resilience, inspires others. On a larger scale, if enough individuals pass their painful tests and integrate these signs, the collective psyche itself evolves. Jung saw this as humanity's hope, transformation of the world through transformation of the individual. Real-life narrative of integration. Imagine someone who lost everything in a devastating betrayal. At first, they resisted reality, consumed by anger and denial. Over time, they accepted the truth. Sign 1. Fear of abandonment loosened its grip, and they began to live without constant anxiety. Sign 2. Their ego identity as the perfect spouse dissolved, making space for authenticity. Sign 3. Gradually, they found meaning, recognizing that the betrayal forced them to confront illusions. Sign 4. This gave them empathy for others facing heartbreak. Sign 5. They no longer sought drama but cultivated calm presence. Sign 6. Eventually, they redefined their life path, pursuing work that aligned with their authentic values. Sign 7. This narrative shows integration. The 7 signs are not isolated but cumulative. Each builds upon the last until the individual embodies wholeness. Their life becomes testimony that suffering, when endured consciously, leads not to destruction but to transformation. Living from the self. The ultimate integration of the 7 signs is living from the self. The self in Jung's model is the organizing principle of the psyche that unites conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, personal and collective. Passing the painful test shifts the center of gravity from ego to self. Life is no longer about defending illusions, but about expressing authenticity. The 7 signs are the markers of this transition. Acceptance anchors the self in reality. Release of fear liberates energy. Ego dissolution clears illusions. Meaning provides coherence. Empathy connects to humanity. Peace stabilizes the psyche. Rebirth embodies the fullness of life. Together, they manifest a life lived from wholeness rather than fragmentation. If these 7 signs resonate with you, it means your soul has already endured its darkest night and emerged stronger. Remember, pain was never the end of your story, it was the beginning of your transformation. Share this video with someone who needs hope. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more Jungian wisdom that awakens the soul.